Bene, allora lascio veramente adesso la parola a Michael Heinrich, che ci parlerà del Materialism di Young Karl Marx. Please. Parlerà ovviamente in inglese.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction to the invitation to speak here, and also for the kind introduction to my person. I don't speak Italian, but I understood some keywords, what you said about me, and maybe it was true what you said. So, I will talk here about the materialism of the young Marx, and this issue is not so much connected with this book which appeared in Italian, but with my biographical project, which also was mentioned. I must therefore say 2 sentences or 3 sentences about this biographical project. It is not a kind of summary of a person who occupied the last 50 years with Marx, and now at the end of my life I try to write a biography. Not at all. For me, this is really a research project where I already had no new insights for myself. It is not just a presentation, what is already clear. It is for myself a rather adventurous journey, not only through the life of Marx, but also through his intellectual development and through the emergence of his work. So in this biography, I try to combine Marx, the scientist, with Marx, the political activist, Marx, the journalist also. All this is included, while in this book, Science of Value, there Marx, the scientist, is in the foreground, and I are mainly focused on theory. In the biography, the scope is much wider, and this wider scope also, in this wider scope, I also tried to put Marx much more in the political and theoretical context of his time. Usually we see only this person Marx developing very exciting ideas. Maybe he's criticizing here and there someone else, but Marx is the big sun, and in big distance perhaps there are some planets, or not even planets. So this I want to correct, this picture in my biography. I pay much more attention to the persons around Marx, opponents as well as friends, and persons who give him inspiration, and this is one reason why this biography will have 4 thick volumes, because I have to talk about much more than Marx alone. One of the consequences of this biography is to question a lot of assumed common knowledge about Marx. A lot of stories, biographical in the narrower sense, but also stories about the emergence of his work, were narrated, copied, re-narrated again and again, without doing a real test. Does it fit to our knowledge of history? Does it fit to our knowledge about other authors, and so on? This I try to do through this biography, and this also has to do with the issue of today, the materialism of the young Karl Marx. There is a rather widespread traditional narrative about the intellectual development of the young Marx. And with young Marx, I mean mainly the Marx between the year 1840 to the year 1845. There is this story that Marx began to study Hegel, that his dissertation is very much influenced by Hegelian idealism. Then Marx, from Hegelian idealism, moved to the young Hegelian approaches, especially the young Hegelian critique of religion. After the critique of religion starts a critique of the state and of politics. And then Ludwig Feuerbach appeared as a new star at the heaven, and inspired by Feuerbach, Marx moved from idealism to materialism, but after a while Marx also overcame Feuerbach. He developed revolutionary communism and finally historical materialism, and then this historical materialism was the base for his later critique of political economy. On the first view, this scheme, this development from idealism to materialism, from a Feuerbach kind of materialism to historical materialism, seems to fit. It sounds rather convincing. However, when you have a closer look, I would say a closer look reveals that nearly nothing of this whole story really fits. It is a good part of fake news, which is copied again and again, and by so much copies it is believed as a simple truth. Now, each such narration, when you look a little bit closer, reveals to be more complicated. That this is the case, this would not be very surprising, that this also holds in the case of Marx. But the point here is a little bit more complicated. I want to show that already the used notions of materialism and idealism, which are used in this narration, don't fit. And in order to show this, I must do a little detour and must go to the sources of these notions of materialism and idealism which we use today. They are mainly a product of the writing of the history of philosophy in the second half of 19th century. For example, the famous book of Friedrich Albert Lange about the history of materialism. He stated a certain view on an opposition of materialism and idealism, which in this way didn't exist before. Regarding now especially the case of Marx, the most influential writing to see the materialism of the young Marx was one of the late pamphlets of Friedrich Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach und das Ende der klassischen und der Ausgang der klassischen deutschen Philosophie, Ludwig Feuerbach and the end of classical German philosophy. First a serial of articles, then put together to a small booklet in 1886, 88, after the death of Marx. This book was used the last 100 years as a kind of guideline to understand nearly everything of the young Marx. And here the first thing I want to stress that this is absolutely against the intention of Engels. Why Engels wrote these articles and this and later it was comprised the articles to the book. It was a rather occasional work for Engels. He was asked if he could write a review about a newly appeared book about Feuerbach, and he accepted. The book he had to review was not very interesting, so it plays not a very big role in this text of Engels, but he took the chance to remind the audience, the public, to the nearly forgotten Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach died in 1871, but even in the last years before his death, he was nearly unknown, and there were only less mentions in main histories of philosophy, like that of Windelband, where Feuerbach was totally degraded as a not very important philosopher. You can forget. So Engels wanted to emphasize Feuerbach as an important figure, and he had also a second intention. In the second half of 19th century in Germany, we were faced with several tendencies of neo-Kantianism, a new tendency which in Germany became dominant, and this tendency degraded nearly everything what had a little bit flavor of materialism. Materialism is the most stupid, the most non-philosophical, it's really nothing. So this was the background of Engels to remember Feuerbach, to remind to Feuerbach, and to defend in a very broad sense materialism against this new neo-Kantianism. However, Engels considered his text really as occasional. He didn't do any special studies for it. He didn't read Feuerbach again, for example. He just used this book he had to review to find some quotes from Feuerbach. He also didn't do any historical research. He just used his memory. But the memory about things which happened 40 years ago is not always very precise. And there are also in his memory some historical errors. But okay, it was not so important for Engels, and I suppose he didn't expect that 130, 140 years after the book appeared, there would be any persons discussing about the book. He would be probably very surprised. However, this book of Engels was used by a more and more dogmatic Marxism, which already started in the late social democracy, German social democracy, the SPD of the late 19th century, which later this dogmatic Marxism continued in Marxism-Leninism in the 20th century. And in this dogmatic view, every text of Marx and Engels was taken out of its context and seen as the expression of an eternal truth. Every statement was a very heavy, important statement, and of course everything must be true. And so this occasional text of Engels became a kind of masterpiece of writing the history of philosophy of the first half of 20th century, and especially the role of Marx and the much less role of Feuerbach. So in Engels' text there was already a tendency, an ontological tendency in the text. When you read Engels' text, you surely remember that Engels put as the basic question of philosophy the opposition between materialism and idealism, the question what is prior, thinking or material being, and according to the answer of this question, Engels wrote, we can see in philosophy two answers, the idealistic answer and the materialistic answer. So the whole history of philosophy, when you take these remarks seriously, is a struggle between idealism and materialism. This, of course, is an enormous simplification, and indeed it is misleading. Therefore, I have to state the political context of Engels' text. He did this, this extremely formulations in a special philosophical and political situation against the claims of neo-Kantianism to state, no, materialism is not something you can forget. Materialism has a root in the whole history of philosophy. So this statement is justified in the struggle, but as a description of the whole history of philosophy, you cannot use it. And even for the early 19th century, it brings a lot of problem. Not only the opposition of materialism and idealism, but also the notion Engels introduced here of materialism and idealism, that the main difference is the priority of thinking or material being. And derived from this, the ordering that Hegel is the idealist and Marx is the materialist. For the first volume of my biography, I checked two contemporary encyclopedias, one from the year 1844, the other from 1848. The entry about Hegel, and in both encyclopedias they argue, of course, Hegel is not an idealist. Kant and Fichte, they are idealists because they try to construct reality from the self, from aus dem Ich, out of the I. We can call them idealists, but Hegel and also Schelling, they are connected to the outer reality. To say they are idealists is just nonsense. Even the term what nowadays is very much used nearly everywhere, German idealism, describing Kant, Fichte, Schelling and Hegel, would sound rather crazy in the early 19th century. Marx used this term, but I will come back to this later, but he used it as a polemic term, not as a scientific description of philosophy. It was a polemic term, and idealism in this, what he called German idealism, was equated with ideology and not with what later is called philosophical idealism. Walter Jeschke, well-known German expert on Hegel, some years, 20 years ago or so, I forgot when, wrote a nice article, when did German idealism emerge? And his answer, in the 1860s. It didn't emerge with Hegel, it emerged in the 1860s with the writings about the history of philosophy. And I must say I completely agree with this estimation. In the 18th and the first half of 19th century, materialism was widely equated with atheism. Who is a materialist? Who denies the existence of a God, of angels, of a spiritual world? And it was very often, especially from the opponents of such materialist positions, concluded the materialists have no moral. They have no God, so they have no morality. Materialists are only oriented to the immediate materialist interests, and this is very bad. So, materialism, until the first half of the 19th century, was not in opposition with idealism, it was in opposition with spiritualism. And even Marx starts with this opposition. In the Kreuznach excerpt, the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, he uses this notion of materialism, talking about the materialism of the bureaucracy, which is oriented at these lower material interests. And even in economic philosophical manuscripts, Marx speaks about overcoming the opposition between materialism and spiritualism. So, for Marx, this was a very clear opposition. On the other hand, when we speak about idealism, it was not opposed to materialism, it was opposed to realism. Realism, in the sense, is there an independent world out of our thinking, or do we mainly construct this outer world? Berkeley in 18th century maybe is a nice example for such a construction, for such a kind of idealism where everything is constructed. But not at all Hegel. In Hegel, in the beginning of his Science of Logic, has a paragraph where he declares the opposition between idealism and realism without any meaning. Hegel's argument mainly is that in order to understand the outer world, we need concepts, we need notions. Insofar, Hegel came to the conclusion every real philosophy is idealistic. This is often quoted, this sentence, but you have to have in mind that this idealistic Hegel meant use of notions, of concepts. And in this sense, every science, of course, is idealistic. Marx, of course, is idealistic. Insofar, this opposition, materialism versus idealism, what nowadays is so often quoted, is a product of a projection of a later discussion, of the discussion of the end of 19th century, a projection to a rather different situation in early 19th century. So, after this long detour, finally I will come to the early Marx. The first texts, scientific texts we have from Marx are his dissertation, which he delivered in April 1841 in Jena. He never studied in Jena. He did a PhD in absence. This was possible in this time. He had not to give an oral exam, and mainly he had not to deliver his dissertation text in Latin. This he would have done, he should do, if he would have did his PhD in Berlin, where he was a student. Then he had to do all this in Latin. He had not very much money in this time. He had to finish the study quickly. He needed already much more than it was usual in this time. 3 years were usual, and Marx studied 5.5 years. The family couldn't bear the costs of this, so he had to be very quick, and he did the easy way with this PhD in absence. However, this doesn't say anything about the quality of the dissertation. Many persons followed this course because the dissertation text was not very good, but this didn't count for Marx. It was mainly a financial problem that he did this. In the dissertation and in the excerpts in which he prepared the dissertation, not all of the excerpts of the notebooks have survived, but a considerable number have survived. We see Marx fighting, struggling with the history of philosophy, especially with Hegel. He was already in this time in young Hegelian discussion circles about philosophy. This one important figure, Bruno Bauer, with him he became close friend. In the literature it is very often said that Bauer was a kind of mentor for Marx. I have my doubts that it was such a one-sided relation. I think more that there was a mutual learning process. Bauer, who was I think 9 years older than Marx. Of course, he had read much more literature when he met Marx. But Bauer came from a theological background. He came from a Protestant family. He studied theology. And even in the year 1835, when from Strauss, in some respect, revolutionary book, The Life of Jesus, appeared, and this life was revealed as a produce of memories of the early Christian communities, but without really historical knowledge. Bauer defended the orthodox position. He even defended the virginity of Maria, the mother of Jesus, as a speculative necessity. It's interesting when you think of contemporary gender discourses, why it was a speculative necessity, because the produce of the male is always limited. The woman has an infinite possibility. And so if Jesus would be produced by the sperm of a male human father, it would be a limited person. Because Jesus is produced by the sperm of the Holy Spirit, he can be an unlimited person, and a woman can give birth to it. So it was a very special gender discourse of Bauer. Only 3 years later, Bauer had very strong atheist positions. So from this really orthodox, narrow-minded position, he came to atheist positions. And these 3 years between this review of Strauss and his atheist positions was the early friendship with Marx. Marx had not such a history as a believer. He believed during his school time, his last, the exams, the essays for ending the school, they show him as a certain kind of believer of a kind of abstract deism. There is a God, but not an adherence to a special cultus. But even this changed already in the first semester at university, what we can conclude from a letter from his father. So Marx had absolutely no emotional binding to religion. He was very early open to atheism, and insofar I would say there was a mutual influence between Bauer and Marx, that probably Marx brought Bauer to atheism or supported strongly this road, and Bauer influenced Marx's reception of Hegel. And this reception of Hegel never was an orthodox reception. Marx was too late. It was too late to become an orthodox Hegelian, so he always became a kind of young Hegelian. This had also problems when you check, I cannot do this here, but when you check a little bit more intensive the way Marx treats Hegel, his critics, it is not so clear, is he really criticizing Hegel, or is he criticizing the young Hegelian image of Hegel? This is always a little bit confused in Marx. Okay, what is the time is running? I said I try to be brief, but probably I will not see success. Okay, so the early Marx, starting with Hegel, with young Hegelians, any opposition between materialism and idealism played absolutely no role in Marx's dissertation. Of course, we can see later interpreters. The dissertation, I suppose you know, is about the difference between Democrite and Epicure, philosophy of nature, and it is very often said, yes, Marx starts with a materialist theme, he praised these early materialists, and this shows he is already on the road to leave idealism and to enter materialism. However, this journey from one country from the country of idealism to the country of materialism plays absolutely no role in the dissertation. What is more important and is the subject of the appendix of the dissertation is the relation religion and philosophy. And Marx was much more involved in the discussions about the philosophy of religion in late 30s and early 40s, what was an important issue for the young Hegelians. It is sometimes said that the young Hegelians criticized religion because the critique of politics was too dangerous in these times. I think this is nonsense. The critique of religion was critique of politics in this time. The Prussian state defined itself as Christian state. The Prussian king was not only formally but really the head of the Protestant church in Prussia. So to criticize religion was an immediate political act. We have only one very short text from Marx dealing with these issues. It's a defense of Bruno Bauer, which appeared in late 1842. But Marx planned much more texts. He wrote one text which is missing. It was censored. It was not allowed to appear in the Rhenanian newspaper. He wrote the manuscript, but the manuscript disappeared. Other texts he had plans to write, but he didn't execute these plans. So this was also one of my surprises when I wrote the first volume of the Marx biography, that he was much more engaged in this, he himself engaged in these discussions about religion than it was clear before. He not only followed them, he tried to intervene. Now this critique of religion, especially when we look on Bruno Bauer, for 5 years closest personal friend of Marx and closest political ally of Marx, then we can see that this was from the beginning a political statement. Douglas Moggach, who wrote or who published almost 20 years ago a very groundbreaking study about Bruno Bauer, he called the position of Bauer revolutionary republicanism. Revolutionary republicanism, which we have to distinguish from a usual liberalism, which very often is ascribed to Bauer. The usual liberalism sees the individual as a kind of atom. It wants to follow his or her interests, the state should guarantee that the individuals could follow their interests, but the state shouldn't intervene, so there is a big distance between the individual and the state. The revolutionary republicanism of Bruno Bauer has a different picture from the individual. The individual in this project has to be a committed person, committed for the social welfare, committed for the functioning of the state. So there is a strong Hegelian tradition about the state as the institution which guarantees freedom, but also connected with some non-Hegelian republicanism tradition. We have no direct documents from Marx, but because Marx was so close to Bauer in these times that he had common projects. For example, the common project to write the second part of with Bauer to write the second part of the trumpet of the what is the English term? The latest judgment, or yeah, the latest. They wanted to write the second part together, so they were very close together. And I think it is not an exaggeration when I assume that in these years also Marx followed this revolutionary republicanism. The split came in the year 43, very clearly expressed in the different articles about the Jewish question, the emancipation of Jewish citizens. Bauer argued that in order to become citizen, you have to abandon your religious bindings. So the Jews have to abandon Judaism, and of course the Christians have to abandon Christianity. In the discussion it was only seen the branch to the Jews usually, but Bauer meant both sides of religion, and Marx criticized this. He accused Bauer of having now a kind of ideological idea of state and citizen, not really coming to the real ground, what for the first time in Marx's article about Jewish question he sees in the material conditions. Very, very vaguely, very superficial, but it shows an important shift of Marx. So, this early, very early period, what I tried to show until now, the dissertation of Marx, the period, also the articles in New Renanian newspaper, we cannot simply say it was Marx, an idealist, moving to materialism. No, it was rather different from these ascriptions. Now let me come to the role of Ludwig Feuerbach, which is in the traditional narrative seen as the most important person who brings Marx from idealism to materialism, and Feuerbach himself is seen as the person who criticized Hegel's idealism. According to Engels' late writing, Ludwig Feuerbach and the Exit of German Classical Philosophy, this happened already in the year 1841 when Feuerbach published his Essence of Christianity. Here Engels appreciates in his late writing that Feuerbach throw away Hegel's idealism, opened a new field, and we all were Feuerbachians in this moment. The history, including Engels' contemporary writings, looks rather different. Essence of Christianity was seen as a conclusion from Hegel. That in religion we see anthropology was seen from the contemporaries as a conclusion from Hegel's philosophy of religion, where Hegel had argued only through the consciousness of humans about God, God can have a consciousness of himself. So it was not anymore a personal God, what is presupposed in Christianity. It was a rather abstract God who needs the relation to humans. Not only the humans need the relation to God, also the other way around. And from Orthodox Protestants, this was criticized heavily as a betrayal of Christianity, as a hidden, as a pantheism which will lead to atheism. And many contemporaries thought that Feuerbach just explicitly draw the conclusions from Hegel, while Hegel feared to do these explicit conclusions, he led more implicit. And Bruno Bauer in the same year published the first part of The Trumpet, where he tried, in a satirical way, but the satire has a real core, tried to convince people Hegel is first an atheist and second a revolutionary. And this was even a critique of Bauer to his contemporary young Hegelians. Hegel is much more radical than all his pupils. Feuerbach in the year 42 had a development, and there he, for the first time, he separated explicitly from Hegel. So it was not essence of Christianity which provoked this split. And even the young Engels, in his first very brilliant philosophical text, Schelling and the Revealing, accepted this. He defended Hegel against being an idealist without connection to reality. He stressed the connection between Hegel and Feuerbach. So if Engels would have read in the 1880s his first pamphlet, which also in this time was written very quickly, which I think showed the genius of Engels, that while he had to do his military duties in Berlin, he visited the lectures of Schelling, and very quickly in the night he wrote down this really brilliant pamphlet. I can only recommend, read it please. We don't read only the young Marx, also you have to read the young Engels. And there I think Engels is much more at the reality that we have not such an early split between Hegel and Feuerbach as Engels stated in his late writings. So, what happened then with the story of Marx? First, no, I have to conclude the story of Feuerbach. Feuerbach started in 42 to come to a separation from Hegel. He also criticized Bauer's pamphlet, The Trumpet, that he says, my Feuerbach's atheism is not the result of philosophy, it is the result of nature. So he made a much more materialistic statement than he ever did in Essence of Christianity. And then finally, in 1843, Feuerbach published two texts about the reformation of philosophy. And this was his attempt to ground a new type of philosophy. And this new type, it was on the one hand materialistic, but what is very interesting, what he accused Hegel not just to be an idealist. He accused Hegel to be a theologian, that with his abstractions he is reproducing theology. And insofar, when Feuerbach in 1843 speaks about materialism, it is still the opposition to spiritualism. The new thing is that now he counts Hegel or Hegel's philosophy as a certain kind of an abstract spiritualism which has to be criticized, but it's still not the opposition from materialism to opposition. And this reading, these texts of Feuerbach, the 43 texts from the year 43, these were very decisive for Marx. It was not essence of Christianity. For Engels, this text was perhaps more decisive because only then Engels had to change his role as a believer. He came from a Protestant family. Atheism was a problem for him. Feuerbach made the course more easy. For Marx, all this was not the problem. But in 43, the critique of Hegel, this was important for Marx. And now Marx also was searching a new ground. And how many time do I have? Okay. Yeah, but I want also to let room for discussion. To make the long story a little bit shorter, what now happened in the writings of Marx, economic philosophical manuscripts, 44, Holy Family, it was written 44, only published 45, and then thesis on Feuerbach and German ideology, was a searching process of Marx, a searching in different directions. But this dogmatic Marxism, and it was, now let me first finish this, it was a searching process, but the young Marx, very self-confident, wrote down his preliminary results in a style as this is the final result, as if this is the solution to all the problems. When you read economic philosophical manuscripts about now it is overcome the opposition between materialism and spiritualism, we have a new humanism, and so on. It is written in with the sound, this is the last word in philosophy. No matter 6 months, 9 months later, he writes something else, but with the same sound of this is the last word. And this dogmatic Marxism, which already transformed Engels' occasional text from the 1880s in the history of philosophy of 19th century took this sound, this special Marx sound of early 40s for real. Every sentence of Marx has to be an eternal truth. And so the searching process of Marx, the changing preliminary results were transformed in eternal results which shall constitute historical materialism or even dialectical materialism. Two phrases, by the way, never used by Marx.
The first one was?
Historical materialism and dialectical materialism. The late Engels, in some places, used the phrase historical materialism, but also only occasionally. But Marx never, neither in his writings, neither in excerpts, neither in drafts, used these two texts. So, what was this searching process of Marx? On the one hand, he searched for, in 44, he searched for a new philosophical base. And he thought he can work on the ground given by Feuerbach. When you read economic philosophical manuscripts and also Holy Family, you will see Feuerbach is appreciated enormously. And even 20 years later, when Marx by accident received a copy of Holy Family, he wrote a letter to Engels and said, "Oh, I read it again, it's not so bad, but this Feuerbach cultus sounds very funny today." So it's, you see there is a big distance already. So Marx was searching for a new philosophical base, overcoming old oppositions like materialism and spiritualism. He also tried to overcome idealism, but idealism in the sense of ideology, of a wrong consciousness of the real, of the real presuppositions of being. Second, Marx used, especially in Holy Family, the term materialism in a polemic sense. Holy Family has the subtitle Gegen Bruno Bauer und Konsorten, against the gang of Bruno Bauer. So already the subtitle is very polemic, and the whole book is polemic to show, oh, these persons, they are bound in their own thinking, they cannot realize what happens, what is going on, they think, they miss the real conditions of society. So here we see a very polemic use of materialism, not a philosophical use, not an attempt to construct a philosophical system. And against Hegel, especially in Holy Family, we see a kind of nominalist critic, that Hegel is accused to make abstractions independent. We have the real fruits, the apple, the orange, the beer, and from this we construct the abstraction fruit. And now Hegel would see the concrete things only as the realization of the abstraction fruit. So in this view, Hegel turns the world upside down. What is the conclusion? The abstraction is transformed in a presupposition. Marx didn't stay with this nominalist critique. In the introduction of 1857, very often wrongly named Introduction to Grundrisse. When Marx wrote this introduction, he had no idea about Grundrisse. Therefore, I stress Introduction of 1857. There, Marx recognizes that he needs abstractions, that he needs notions. He made the distinction which later Althusser emphasized a lot between the real object and the object of knowledge. The real object, Marx wrote in the section on method of the introduction, the only way to recognize the real object is to produce a thought object, a thought concretion, in German Gedankenkonkretum. And how this is produced? By concepts, by notions. So Marx realized you need notions. He accuses then still that Hegel transforms these abstract notions in the creators of reality, and he repeats this accusation in the postface to the second edition of the first volume of Capital. However, I think when you read Hegel, there is not really a source that Hegel uses the idea as the creator of the world. In the Encyclopedia, for example, Hegel clearly states the priority of nature. But nature we want to recognize, we cannot immediately do, we need the notions for this recognition. Insofar, the critique of Marx is misleading in some respect, but what is more important for us is, or for the issue today, is that he abandoned this nominalist critique of Hegel, which he promoted in Holy Family. In the thesis on Feuerbach and German ideology, Marx goes one step further. Here we can see the clear separation from Feuerbach. Half a year earlier, Feuerbach was praised enormously in Holy Family. Now he was criticized. The reasons for this, most persons or authors see the reason for this in development of Marx. Marx realized this or that. Here in Science of Value, I have a short chapter on the early Marx. I try to support this position. It is not discovered by me. Others had this before. That Stirner's critique, Max Stirner's critique of Feuerbach, was the decisive point to inspire Marx and Engels to criticize Feuerbach. We can see in this young Hegelian discourse a kind of permanent overwhelming they not only criticize each other in the way to say, oh, you published this, you had this result, and I think this result is wrong. No, criticism in this time, critique, has to be much more. Already your question was wrong. Not only your answer is wrong, your question is wrong, your presuppositions are wrong. And so Feuerbach criticized in 43 Hegel to be a theologian. Stirner criticized Feuerbach, and you with your abstract man, you are the theologian. No, I can be with my ego, the ego and the only, I'm not sure about the English translation of the book. I am the one who really breaks this theology. And of course, Marx and Engels also had to overcome this, not only to say it is a wrong result, it is a wrong question. In German ideology, the biggest part is about Stirner. It is not about Feuerbach, and this was the part which was written first, and it was also not from the beginning written as a book. There is a complicated history of German ideology. I cannot go in details, but what is important for our context, the Stirner critique was important not to let Stirner to have the position to have the highest critique in this staircase. So Stirner had to be criticized. This happens in this enormous big part of German ideology. And then the chapter on Feuerbach is not really a critique of Feuerbach. It is more a conclusion from the Stirner critique what has to be done. So what is before, I said there are two lines. Materialism is used as a polemic notion, and then it is used in a searching project to give a new philosophical base. Now these two lines go together in these manuscripts of German ideology. Also the chapter on Feuerbach is not really a chapter, it consists of different manuscripts. You should use the mega volume when you want to work with German ideology, which separates all the different manuscripts, not fitting them together to a book like it was done in the past. However, this attempt to bring together the polemic side and the grounding side of materialism, also this is only preliminary in German ideology. When we now make a jump to the year 57 and after, then we can see the use of materialism in Marx is very, very rare. Contrary to modern Marxists who always stress, yes, Marx, the materialist, Marx is not at all stressing this. Sometimes he mentions this, but he's not at all stressing this. And when he uses materialism, there is still this polemic use, like in the post-phase of the second edition of Capital. But when he uses this, for example, in Capital, then it is not used in an ontological sense. Materialism as ontology, it is used as a synonym for a certain scientific method. There is a very instructive footnote in Capital where Marx mentions when you explain the ideological phrases, when you criticize the ideological phrases as wrong, this is not really science. Science is to explain the emergence of the ideological phrases from the ground, from the material ground. This is the only true materialistic method. So I would conclude, and with this I come to end, for the late Marx, materialism is not at all an ontology which we can oppose to an idealist ontology. Materialism for the late Marx is a certain scientific method. To this, the searching process of the 40s led to this result. And what you can read in this big bulk of Marxist literature, mainly, I don't want to be too general, but then what you can read in many of these works is a kind of simplification, of dogmatization, of preliminary statements of Marx of the 40s. Not seeing the context, not seeing the development, the permanent development in this time, and not recognizing what we had in the end, materialism as methodology. So, this is the end. Thank you very much for
very good. Thanks very much for this exposition, for this speech. I come back to Italian. Dunque ringraziamo il professor Heinrich per questa sintesi così complessa, anche perché il tema, l'argomento è molto complesso. Abbiamo una buona mezz'ora abbondante per poter fare un piccolo dibattito, e qui apro, facendo io una piccola premessa che permetto di avere la prima parola, poi la ultima lascia voi, sulla questione dell'opposizione idealismo-materialismo. About the opposition, about your position between idealism and materialism. I study a lot this question in the group of research on history of materialism, because the studies that we make about these topics shows that the first appearing of the term materialism is a polemical appearance, and we can, for the first time, set up in the first time in the 1671, the Digging Dialogues of Henry Moore. In the Digging Dialogues of Henry Moore, we find the opposition between the materialist and the materialist, the Cartesian, the philosopher that from Descartes divided res extensa and res cogitans, and they are called by one of the persons, the characters of the David Dialogues, materialist, and the other characters in this dialogue is the idealist. So this opposition of materialist and idealist exists since 1670. And we find again this opposition between idealist and materialist in Charles Wolff, in the Psychologia Rationalis 1735. It's Wolff in Germany that states that there is an opposition, ontological and historical opposition between materialist Hobbes, Obesius, the chief materialist, and the Bishop of Cologne, Berkeley. So I not agree with your exposition when you call about the rare opposition between idealist and materialist. It exists since one century. And more, the term spiritualism appears late in the vocabulary of the 17th and 18th century. We find, for the first time in French, which I studied in the French philosophy, we find spiritualism only at the beginning of the 19th century. And it depends, my opinion, from Victor Cousin. Victor Cousin, the Hegelianist, French Hegelianist, introduced this use of spiritualism. So I give some suggestions from the history of philosophy and philology of the problem of materialism. So we must be very attentive about this question about the use of material. It's true that Marx used the term material in a polemic way. This is sure. Also Marx used, when he used idealism or spiritualism or materialism, he do this in a polemical sense, in a polemical way. So this is the first question, and if there are other questions in the public, potete anche farla in italiano, quello traduciamo per gli studenti. Riccardo Pozzo, my colleague of History of Philosophy.
Thank you very much for the invitation to use media. I like very much what you said about looking the manuscripts, and too bad we don't have the manuscript of the Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. But the question is, so is there be a patchwork theory, a patchwork book, just like the Critique of Pure Reason is a patchwork book, with a correction of several manuscripts from many. Sorry, I'm asking because I haven't seen the edition, but I take it it's important for doctoral students that they know the nature of the text. The second, I like very much what you said about the frequencies of mentions of materialism after 48. And I have one question that perhaps of interest. First, in Italy, we are used to think of Kant's early writings as philosophy of history. And that's a definition that was given by Norberto Bobbio in the early 60s. And then the science of political economy. Do you agree with that? That there is no science in the early manuscripts, the first thing. And second, since you've been talking about very many things, I was wondering if there is already about the origins of Kant's Marx's so-called ecological notebooks, which are later, 57, but you spoke about everything. So is there a connection between what you said and what Marx is going to write on ecology?
Grazie. Claudio Corradetti?
Yes.
Please.
Claudio
Corradetti.
I had, thanks first of all for your presentation, which unexpectedly, to me at least, but very interestingly covered a much earlier period than I thought we were going to cover. So my question is on, in a way, something that will possibly follow from your very wide reconstruction of this very early period of time, which is mainly one concept which I think, understanding your speech, I think would become a key concept in the economic philosophical manuscript, in the first manuscript, which is the notion of alienation as a key notion for expanding this goal of materialism as a searching concept, and which becomes something more, particularly because it's connected to the force of the working force as a way of constituting or answering to the subsistence condition of the human being. And a second notion, which I think is also connected to the first, that is in the third thesis on Fourier, which is this dynamical idea of nature that is like a key diverging point from a different conception of materialism.
Thank you, Claudio. Very good. Are there other questions?
Posso farla
in tedesco? Auf Deutsch it's too much difficult. Fala tedesco. Auf Deutsch.
Also vielen Dank für Ihren Aufsatz, sehr interessant. Und ich wollte eigentlich fragen, und zwar wollte ich zwei Fragen stellen, aber zuerst die erste. Und zwar diese Beziehung zwischen, oder Streit zwischen Neumaterialismus und Materialismus. Sie sagten zuerst am Ende der 80er Jahren des 19. Jahrhunderts. Und dann können Sie ein bisschen vertiefen diesen Begriff, was Sie meinten als Streit zwischen diesen Positionen. Und wie könnte der Materialismus eine höhere Position bekommen oder zu einer höheren Position kommen? Dankeschön.
Allora,
lo traduco
in italiano.
Ho chiesto, lui aveva parlato del rapporto tra neocantismo e materialismo e quindi della predominanza del neocantismo alla fine degli anni 80 dell'Ottocento e quindi della difficoltà, sì, un po' anche da prima, della difficoltà anche di poter far emergere poi all'interno della scena culturale europea il materialismo. Quindi ho chiesto di approfondire questa
Io penso che I think that the first book of this
first, you questioned my statement that this materialism, idealism would play no role. Maybe I have to be a little bit more concrete. From Engels, many Marxists concluded from Engels' text that the whole history of philosophy you can read as the struggle between materialism and idealism. As I'm not an expert in the history of philosophy, but for me this sounds not very plausible. That you can find some struggles, some discussions which fit in this framework, that even the words are used, I don't deny. But the way this is the guideline for the whole history of philosophy, I think this fits not very much. And my second point was, and this was even more important for me here, that for the early 20th century, not 20th century, 19th century, for the emergence of Marx thinking, this opposition at the beginning also didn't play a role. And insofar, there are discussions with Marx dissertation, how much he was idealistic or was he already some materialistic. I think this is a wrongly posed question. We cannot see there's something. With spiritualism, it's an interesting idea. If Cousin introduced this in German debate, I have my doubts, because when were the first translations of Cousin, I think this one small booklet where Schelling wrote the preface, it was in 1834. I don't know if this was so influential, so I suppose, it's only a supposition, that spiritualism was already earlier, before Cousin. But okay, this I don't know. German ideology, yeah, this is a story of itself, or would need a whole lecture, because also here we have to see the history of reception of German ideology. When it was published for the first time in early 1930s, it was seen as the founding book for historical materialism. Already there, one could question, when it was really such a founding book, why Marx and Engels didn't make an attempt to publish it. Why they just let it during the lifetime of Marx, and then Engels, when he published for the first time the thesis on Feuerbach, he said, yeah, these old manuscripts, they will not help us. So, at least the evaluation of many Marxists, that groundbreaking book, and the evaluation of Marx and Engels, manuscripts you can forget, they diverge a lot. Second, it was already in the first edition in the 1930s, it was presented as a book. But this is not true. It was articles for a journal. It should also include articles from Weidemeyer, at the beginning from Moses Hess, then there was a trouble with Moses Hess. The journal couldn't appear. Then they thought, we can perhaps publish a 2-volume work. But then they had a quarrel with the publisher. Then they tried to find other places to publish, always with changing manuscripts. So you have not just a few manuscripts which were put together by Marx and Engels. No, you have changing manuscripts. They never really put together, only later editors put together and then said, this is the groundbreaking book, what we put together. Insofar, we have to be very cautious. We have to see the different character instead of one book. We have, I forgot the precise number, I think 30 different manuscripts in the mega volume. And what is important, I think, for the understanding is the timeline in which these manuscripts were written down. We not always can be sure about this timeline. And sometimes manuscripts were written simultaneously. Therefore, in the mega volume, they don't publish the manuscripts according to the timeline, but according this systematic approach. The edition is perfect, but the order of the text, I criticize. The order of the text repeats the old misleading impression you have already made. There is a brilliant introduction in this mega volume. I can only recommend this introduction, and this introduction in some respect refuses the order of the manuscripts in the book. So use this introduction as guideline, use the manuscripts, but don't have the impression, oh, more or less it is a book. No, it is not. Okay, Kant's early writing in philosophy, if this is a history, I don't know. I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a Kant expert, I cannot say this. You relate them to the famous sentence from Marx and Engels, there is only one science, the science of history. I would in some respect agree that you have to put everything in historical context. But especially with Capital, for example, this Marx Capital, we cannot say this is a historical work which shows the development of capitalism from early stages to late. No, it is a systematic work where at certain well-defined points we need to access to history. So there is only one science. No, there are more sciences than history, but everything has to put in historical context. So I would say is a rational version of this sentence. Ecological notebooks. Yeah, I'm not sure if they can deliver something especially to the question of materialism. You have also notebooks about natural sciences in Marx, where Marx tries to get knowledge of all these different fields, but if they can really deliver new aspects to a Marxian materialism, I must say I don't know. I also didn't study intensively these notebooks that I can come to a judgment of this. Alienation, expanding materialism, and the third thesis on Feuerbach with a dynamic character of nature. Alienation, I would say, in economic philosophical manuscripts has a strong influence of Feuerbach, of course, and from there it is also influenced by the abstract notion of human beings, and this theory of alienation reproduces this abstraction in an abstract view in history. You have an early phase without abstraction, then comes a long phase, an early phase without alienation, then comes a long phase with alienation, and the task for the future is to abandon alienation. I would say this is a kind of history Marx later overcomes. He sees that such simple 3 steps history are not enough. However, the characterization of the essence of human, what he uses in historical, in economic philosophical manuscripts, human as a sensuous person, as a social person, and so on. This, I would say, you can use as a kind of characterization of the kind of materialism Marx in these years was searching as a philosophical basis. In my view, he didn't say to this, but in these years it counts to this. Neo-Kantianism in 80s. There were a tendency, especially in Germany, I don't know how much in other countries, to praise again Kant as the top philosopher, and the others are in the shadow of Kant. Hegel, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, okay, they learned something from Kant, but they couldn't overwhelm him. They believed maybe that they overwhelmed Kant, but no, Kant was so big they couldn't do. And the materialists like Feuerbach, it is a kind of degeneration of philosophical discourse. And against such positions, very popular in German philosophy in this time, Engels was fighting with his text.
Well, are there any other questions?
Posso chiedere in italiano riferito
Sì,
al rapporto il rapporto Marx e Kant, Marx, Hegel e le tesi revisioniste di Bernstein, se possono inserirsi in questo discorso del neocantismo, cioè il giovane Marx che viene interpretato in chiave, diciamo così, revisionista kantiana anziché hegeliana. Ci sono stati abbastanza dibattiti, no, mi sembrava, insomma, ero curiosa per la posizione.
She asked about the importance of the Bernstein revisionism, who read again Marx at the light of Kant instead of Hegel. What do you think about if there is an important issue for this?
Yeah, there is an important issue. I would say not so much for the young Marx, but for the debate at the end of 19th century. This neo-Kantianism influenced a lot leftist thinkers. It was not Bernstein, it was also others in early 20th century. And you know, the influence of Hegel had also in the second half of 19th century a very bad image in German philosophy. In 1857 the biography of Rudolf Heim of Hegel appeared, and he devalued Hegel completely as a not scientific thinker you cannot rely on. And such positions like that of Rudolf Heim became very popular in the second half of 19th century, and they were also used against Marx. When Marx rests on such an unscientific philosopher, then his results also must be very bad. And some leftists like Bernstein said, yeah, but the influence of Hegel was not so big. The real philosopher who played a role was Kant, and at the same time Kant was praised. So when Marx related to Kant, you cannot use this as an argument against Marx. But for the young Marx, of course, he read some Kant. With this biographical work, I already learned that the father of Marx read Kant. He mentioned in letters to Marx certain Kantian ideas in a way that they are well known to the young Marx. So they must have already discussions about Kant. Marx, in his dissertation, quotes Kant's critique of the ontological proof of God. So this is a clear incident that you have a certain knowledge. Nevertheless, I think it was not so much influential. It is much more the influence of Hegel. What a philosopher which is more influential for him, what was discussed in late 20th century then, is Spinoza. That you have only very less quotes or hints to Spinoza, but always in central points. And we have already early notes on Spinoza. The funny thing is not done by Marx himself. He let another student do excerpts from the writing of Spinoza, but he must give to the student very detailed orders what you have to excerpt. So he must have a knowledge before this excerpt. So there are some difficult ways, but until now I didn't find so much hints that Kant played an extraordinary role.
Thank you.
Ci abbiamo ancora 5 minuti per una domanda, l'ultima. Uno studente, via. Abbiamo qui i nostri che si vergognano terribilmente, non è? Vabbè. Nel vicino, non te li sceglie qualcuno che faccia la parte?
Io?
No, tu l'hai già fatto. Se ce n'è un'altra sotto la lascio fare.
Sì, ma solo in cinese.
Solo in cinese però. Se non ce ne sono, lei vuole fare. Oh, ecco.
Thank you for the discussion. It was really clear, and I have a question about, for example, the activism of human being in Marx that we haven't discussed at the moment of the time, or the large historical period that we speak about. But I was curious about your point about the activism of human in this case and in this historical period you analyzed.
I didn't understand the activity of humans or
Activism
of Marx.
No, the active part of human being.
Of course, this is one of the big themes of Marx. He accuses also Feuerbach to have this abstract picture of humans, which has not very much to do with activism. I'm not sure if this critique really is fitting, because Feuerbach had more to deliver than just what Marx criticized. But for Marx himself, this activism was very clear, and in some respect, I would say it is a kind, in the first instance, a translation from Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. You have phenomenology of spirit. You could translate the adventures of the spirit, the adventures of the active spirit. And Marx tried to translate this away from the spirit to the humans in history. And insofar, there is from the beginning of his own conception this idea of activism. However, activism always is limited, and also needs a surrounding. In the thesis on Feuerbach, there is this nice phrase that also the educators need education. It is clear that the educators not just come from the nothing, there is an environment. And later there is this famous phrase from at the beginning of 18th Brumaire, the humans make the history by themselves, but they make history under certain conditions which they didn't produce, which they just find. Maybe the conditions are produced by earlier generations, but not by our generation. We must now be active under these conditions. And this point, I think, is coming more and more. So in economic philosophical manuscript, and somehow in the thesis on Feuerbach is stressing the term praxis, which never again became so important like in the thesis. Marx stresses the activism, and in later writings more and more stresses this activism is not a total activism, a totally free activism. This activism is bound in certain social limits, conditions.